He said, the only thing that matters to you in this important game is that it was played on the 4th of July. I kind of looked at him and said, the 4th of July, okay, the birthday of America. I thought he's probably deranged. I mean, what is this all about? I mean, of course, it turned out to be immensely prescient and very telling, actually, of my own personal history. Okay? So, quickly back to the Danube. We're going down on this beautiful, actually, Austrian-built boat, and we're going down, and very quickly what became clear to me was that there was an upstairs and a downstairs. You remember that wonderful British BBC soap opera, but wonderful, upstairs, downstairs of the Bellamy family. And the upstairs for me were all these upper middle class, highly educated American alums of these fancy universities who clearly had been to Europe many times, because obviously for you to book a very expensive trip from Vienna to Istanbul means that you've already seen Paris and Rome and Venice and Geneva and London, okay? So these were very well-traveled people, and I remember that the only thing that interested the men in the upstairs was to get to a kiosk somewhere in Budapest or in Bratislava to find the International Herald Tribune, to figure out desperately what the series was between the Boston Celtics and the Houston Rockets, okay? And then late at night, I went into the downstairs of the boat and suddenly conversed, even though I do not speak a number of languages, but do not speak any of the Slavic languages. And the sailors were all Bulgarian, Ukrainian, Russian. And yet we found a very quick common language by watching the television, which actually broadcast the games from Mexico, the World Cup games. And this, in fact, created in me this interest of why are the languages, and in the new book, I talk about sports as languages. Why are actually these languages very similar, that in fact they do the same thing, except that they're not mutually intelligible, okay? That the upstairs people were talking basketball, the downstairs people were talking football. By the way, apropos British, please, I always tell my American students, that having taught thousands of them already in my sports course, I know that there are at least enough Americans who know for a fact that when they use the word soccer, that they should not have some Brit, in fact, of course, lace into them as yet another manifestation of an American abomination in terms of undermining some kind of European Kulturgut. Because, of course, it's an American expression. It is not. Soccer is a British student slang expression. It's the shortened version for the term association. Okay? And it actually hails from Cambridge University in the 1840s, 50s, and around then. Okay? So, in fact, it's as English as can be. The reason I'm emphasizing this is that North Americans, of course, already culturally so inferior, I'm talking about intellectuals, okay, to whom obviously we know all these studies in marketing that clearly a British accent is a phenomenal advantage. You know, it just is. Of course, we don't differentiate between what kind of British accent. A great dissertation, actually, I think at Yale, that showed that the British invasion in the 60s, which was basically bringing Chicago blues via Liverpool and London back to the United States, proliferated precisely because Americans just went gaga that these guys, you know, spoke, you know, John Lennon said, it's a little bit of an oldie now entitled Monet or something, so they went crazy. So the point is about all this is that these languages really form similar communities, but they are actually mutually unintelligible, and in fact create their own histories, their own icons. So clearly, upstairs, the games were immediately historicized in terms of what happened with, you know, the Boston Celtics of the 60s, Bill Russell, et cetera, et cetera. So it presumes tremendous historical knowledge, clearly in what is, of course, in American English called inside baseball. I always tell my German friends, when you want to translate Fachwissen, okay, then you actually use the word inside baseball. That's what that means. In other words, expertise means actually using that term. And then, of course, the downstairs, these Russian and Bulgarian and and Ukrainian sailors with whom I barely could speak, but we could actually speak because we went something like Bobby Charlton. Oh, yeah, Bobby Charlton. Okay. Or, in other words, there were clearly historical markers that, in fact, created an obvious bond between me and these guys, with whom I actually otherwise have very little in common. So, why is this sort of all interesting? Well, I think it's interesting because there are sort of two stories to this, and I'll do this very quickly. First, the story of the early book. In other words, what happens when these disparate games that have existed all the time, in fact, every culture has known games of some sort. The great Dutch sociologist, historian sociologist, Johan Huizinga, has a brilliant book called Homo Ludens, in other words, the playing man. I would actually extend it and say that it's actually not only playing man, it's probably playing primates or maybe even canines. There's something in us that actually plays in some way. So clearly this is ubiquitous to all cultures. Chinese, Inca, the old Romans played a game called Harpastum, which was something kind of a kicking, Urfußball kind of thing, but it existed everywhere, okay? And they have also, of course, also existed in the Middle Ages, and actually some of their remnants now as kind of almost like a touristic expression exist to this day. So if you ever go to the town of Ashbourne in Derbyshire, you will see on Shrove Tuesday and the day after a game between the upwards and the downwards. And this is kind of a wild football game, not always including a ball, where basically there are 1,000 to a side. And it's kind of this more or less kind of pretty much like a controlled riot, more or less. There's some rules. Anyway, the point is that these things exist constantly. The legacy that this game that I just mentioned has left to the rest of the world is that, of course, what we call now a rivalry game in the world of association football is called derby or derby in every language, other than the Latins call it classico. So in other words, again, formerly, I think that's changed, let's say clearly to use Canadian language, let's say the Montreal Canadiens and against the Toronto Maple Leafs. This was a classical rivalry game. Rivalry games that are always either in the same city or very nearby each other. They are the ones who really hate each other the most, a la Freud's narcissism of small differences. Brilliant, okay? I always tell my students, and they look very odd, I said, what is the difference between you and Ohio State students, really? And they go, you can see they literally freeze. I said, what's the difference? I mean, honestly, yeah, your SAT scores are 30 points higher, but what's the difference? You hate them, right? I said, oh, God. I said, see, that's the point. And yet, narcissism of small differences, okay? And that word has entered the vernacular of sports languages as derby, local derby, that comes from this instance in Derbyshire. Now, very briefly, what happens to this world of these disparate, weird games that exist everywhere, that have a couple of things that are in common? Number one, there are no written rules. Number two, they're totally local. In fact, village A can't speak to village B. Okay? And interestingly, and I'll get to that later also, they're virtually exclusively male. And I'll talk about the gendered nature of all this in a minute. Now, what happens is that in the post-Napoleonic era, or actually already earlier in Britain, there commences a modernization process, if you will. We were just celebrating the amazing, last Saturday, the 50th anniversary of the legendary social studies major at Harvard, founded by Barrington Moore Jr., and this is Barrington Moore. Basically, the question is, why, and Norbert Elias, what is it about Britain in particular that transforms these spontaneous, wild, local, disparate games into modern sports?